He sued me over water. Not a fence, not a tree branch hanging too low, not loud music at midnight. Water. That's how this whole thing started. And if you'd told me 2 years ago that turning on my sprinklers would land me in a courtroom, I would have laughed and handed you a beer. My name's Daniel Harper. I live in a quiet subdivision just outside of Fort Collins, Colorado. Nothing fancy, just one of those newer developments where the houses look like cousins of each other and the HOA sends emails about trash cans being visible from the street. We're at the edge of town, where the land starts to roll a little, not dramatic hills, just gentle slopes that make mowing slightly more annoying than it needs to be. My lot sits a bit higher than the one directly behind me. Not by much, maybe 4 feet of elevation difference from my back patio to the base of my neighbor's yard. When the development was first built, the original owner of that lower lot had a retaining wall put in, stacked stone, decorative, with little weep holes along the bottom to let water drain out. It looked nice. Still does, honestly. When I moved in, the house behind me was owned by a guy named Leonard Briggs. Mid-50s, retired early from some regional insurance firm. The kind of man who irons his jeans and says things like, "I've run the numbers." He wasn't unfriendly at first. Just particular. Very particular. I water my lawn twice a week. Early mornings, 5:30 a.m., before the sun gets too high. I've got a basic irrigation system on a timer. Nothing wild. I follow the city guidelines, especially during the dry months. Colorado's summers are no joke, and if you don't stay consistent, your lawn turns into a crunchy brown carpet real fast. For the first year, there were no issues. We'd wave over the fence. He'd comment on the Broncos. I'd help him move a grill once. Normal neighbor stuff. Then one afternoon in late June, he knocked on my door holding a manila folder like it contained nuclear launch codes. "Daniel," he said, not smiling. "We need to talk about your watering schedule." I remember blinking at him. My watering schedule? He opened the folder and pulled out printed photos. Close-ups of damp soil at the base of his retaining wall. "This," he said, tapping the photo, "is from this morning. The soil behind my wall is being saturated. Your irrigation is destabilizing my property." I thought he was joking. I actually laughed. Not in a mean way, just confused. "Leonard, it's just sprinklers. The water goes straight down." He didn't laugh back. "You're uphill. Water follows gravity." I told him I had drip zones and rotary heads adjusted to avoid overspray. I told him the runoff never even crossed the sidewalk. He just kept shaking his head like I was a child explaining why the dog ate the homework. Over the next few weeks, he brought it up 3 more times, each time more intense. He started using phrases like hydrostatic pressure and lateral migration. At one point he said, "I've done my research." That phrase should have been my warning. About a month later, I was sitting at my kitchen table going through work emails when a process server knocked on my door. You don't forget that feeling. It's like your stomach drops half an inch before your brain catches up. Leonard was suing me. The complaint said my lawn irrigation constituted a private nuisance and was causing structural damage to his retaining wall. It claimed the mortar joints were cracking because my watering schedule was increasing pressure behind the wall. I stood there in my kitchen reading that document 3 times, hoping I'd misunderstood it. But no, it was real. I'll be honest, the first emotion wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Then embarrassment. What would the neighbors think? What would the HOA think? I could already picture the gossip. I hired a local attorney named Michelle Carter. Sharp, calm, didn't sugarcoat anything. "First thing," she said in our initial meeting, "don't talk to him about this anymore. Not one word. Second, we're getting an independent soil engineer." A week later, a man named Dr. Aaron Patel came out to inspect both properties. He walked the slope, checked the soil composition, measured moisture levels at different depths. He even scoped the drainage gaps in Leonard's wall. His conclusion was simple. "The soil here drains primarily vertically," he told us, standing between our yards. "It's a clay-rich loam, yes, but under normal irrigation rates, you're not generating lateral hydrostatic pressure. That's not how this system behaves." In plain English, my sprinklers weren't the villain. But lawsuits don't disappear just because they don't make sense. Discovery began. Paperwork piled up. Every letter from Michelle came with another bill attached. I started lying awake at night thinking about worst-case scenarios. What if a judge sided with him just to be safe? What if I had to tear out my entire irrigation system? What if this dragged on for years? And then one night, staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m., I had a thought that changed everything. If Leonard truly believed the water was the problem, what would happen if there was no water at all? Not reduced watering, not adjusted zones. None. The next morning, before leaving for work, I turned off the irrigation system at the control box in my garage. I didn't set it to seasonal delay. I didn't tweak it. I shut it down completely. No sprinklers. No hose. No hand watering. Nothing. If water was the enemy, I was about to remove it from the equation and let the soil decide who was right. And that's when things started to get interesting. At first, nothing dramatic happened. The first week, without water, my lawn still looked fine. Colorado soil holds on to moisture longer than you'd think, especially if you've been watering consistently. The grass stayed green, maybe a little less vibrant, but nothing alarming. If Leonard noticed, he didn't say anything. We weren't speaking anyway, not since Michelle had told me to cut off communication. By week 2, though, the edges started to fade. The tips of the blades turned a dull yellow. When I walked across the yard, it didn't spring back quite as easily. It felt different under my shoes, less forgiving, more brittle. I'd stand at my kitchen window in the mornings, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over a lawn that was slowly giving up. There's something strangely personal about grass dying. You spend time maintaining it, trimming it, watering it, and when it starts to go, it feels like you're neglecting something alive. But I kept reminding myself, this was temporary. This was data. By week 3, the transformation was obvious. My yard had shifted from green to patchy gold. The ground, especially in the hotter spots near the retaining wall, had hardened. Small hairline cracks began to form in the soil surface, thin at first, then widening as the days hit the high 90s. I didn't say anything to Leonard. I didn't need to. He saw it. One afternoon, as I was pulling into my driveway, I caught him standing near the base of his retaining wall, arms crossed, staring up at my yard like it had personally offended him. He looked up at me, expression unreadable, and then turned back to the wall. A few days later, I got an email from Michelle. Leonard's attorney is requesting updated inspection photos. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Dr. Patel came back out. This time, the readings were different. He pushed the moisture probe into the ground at several points behind my yard and near the wall. Seasonal lows, he said. About as dry as it gets. He crouched near the retaining wall and ran his hand along one of the mortar joints. There was a visible gap now, wider than before. Not catastrophic, but undeniable. The clay content here is significant, he explained, almost like he was teaching a class. When it dries, it contracts. It pulls away from structures. That movement can stress masonry, especially if the wall doesn't have proper reinforcement or drainage backing. He didn't say it with any drama, just matter of fact. A week later, during a scheduled inspection coordinated through the attorneys, Leonard and I ended up in the same physical space for the first time since the lawsuit was filed. Not speaking, just standing on opposite sides of the property line while Dr. Patel and Leonard's engineer compared notes. Leonard's engineer, a younger guy in a polo shirt with a company logo, looked uncomfortable. He measured the gaps, scribbled numbers on a clipboard, then stepped back. Leonard finally broke the silence. "You stopped watering," he said, not looking at me, but at my yard. "Yes," I said. "For how long?" "About 6 weeks." He nodded slowly, jaw tight. Later that evening, as I was taking the trash bins to the curb, he walked over. No lawyers. No engineers. Just him. "You're doing this on purpose," he said. I met his eyes. "I'm removing the variable you said was the problem. You're damaging your own property to make a point." "Am I?" I asked. He didn't answer that. Here's the thing about Leonard. Over time, I started to realize this wasn't just about water. It was about control. He had been one of the first homeowners in the subdivision. He'd served on the HOA board for 2 years. He was used to being the guy who spotted problems, who corrected people, who kept things in order. When I moved in, I didn't ask his advice. I didn't consult him about landscaping choices. I just lived my life. And I think that bothered him more than either of us wanted to admit. The dry spell stretched on. By month 2, my lawn was fully brown. Not dead, technically, just dormant. The soil near the retaining wall had visibly separated in places. You could slide a finger into the gap between the dirt and the stone in a few spots. And the cracks in the mortar? They were wider than in any of the original photos he'd submitted with the complaint. Depositions were scheduled. If you've never sat for a deposition, it's a strange experience. You're in a conference room, fluorescent lights humming, a court reporter typing every word you say. Leonard sat across from me, his attorney to his right. Michelle sat beside me, calm as ever. Leonard's attorney asked about my watering schedule, my knowledge of soil behavior, my intentions when I shut off the irrigation system. Was it your goal to worsen the condition of the retaining wall? He asked. No, I said evenly. My goal was to eliminate irrigation as a factor. When it was Leonard's turn, he insisted the damage had been ongoing long before the lawsuit. Michelle slid a set of printed photographs across the table. Time-stamped. Clear. Taken by Leonard himself when he first confronted me. In those images, my lawn was green and healthy. The mortar cracks were visible but narrow. Then she placed the recent photos beside them. Same angles. Same lighting. The difference was obvious. Dr. Patel testified that consistent, moderate moisture can actually help stabilize expansive clay soils. Rapid drying, especially after a period of regular watering, increases shrinkage and movement. That movement can place stress on structures that lack proper footings or drainage systems. And here's the kicker. During discovery, we obtained the original construction details of Leonard's retaining wall. It turned out the wall didn't have a proper gravel backfill layer. No perforated drain pipe behind it. The footings were shallower than recommended for our soil type. In other words, the wall was more decorative than structural. The silence in that deposition room when that came out was heavy. Leonard's face went red. Not cartoonishly, just enough that you could see the shift. The narrative he'd built, the certainty that he'd been wronged by my sprinklers, started to wobble. A week later, Michelle called me. They want to discuss settlement. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling again, just like that night 2 months earlier. Only this time, I wasn't anxious. What kind of settlement? I asked. They're proposing dismissal with prejudice. Each side covers their own costs. No admission of fault. No check written to me. Just done. Part of me wanted more. An apology. A public acknowledgement. Something that said, you were wrong. But another part of me was tired. So I agreed. The paperwork was filed. The case was dismissed. Officially over. Or at least, legally over. Because what happened next, after the lawsuit disappeared, is what really changed how I see neighbors, conflict, and the thin line between being right and being at peace. The day the dismissal became official, nothing dramatic happened. No fireworks. No dramatic music swelling in the background. Just an email from Michelle with a PDF attached and a short line that read, "It's done." I stood in my backyard that evening, looking at a lawn that resembled a wheat field in late August and a retaining wall that had cost both of us more than it ever should have. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across the slope, and for the first time in months, I felt still. Not victorious, just still. A week later, I turned the irrigation system back on. I didn't blast it. I didn't try to overcorrect. I reseeded the worst patches, set the timer to a conservative schedule, and let the water return gradually. Within 2 weeks, green began creeping back in. Dormant grass has a funny way of forgiving you when conditions improve. I'd be lying if I said I didn't glance at Leonard's wall every morning for a while. The cracks were still there, faint reminders of everything that had unfolded. But they weren't getting worse. About a month after the case ended, a contractor's truck showed up in Leonard's driveway. Then another. For 3 days, there was drilling, digging, the smell of fresh gravel. They partially dismantled the wall, excavated behind it, installed proper drainage pipe and backfill, and poured deeper footings in sections. I watched from my kitchen window, not with satisfaction exactly, but with a quiet acknowledgement. This was the work that should have been done from the start. One afternoon, as the crew was wrapping up, Leonard walked up the slope toward my fence. I happened to be outside adjusting a sprinkler head. We stood there for a second, the air thick with everything unsaid. They found inadequate drainage, he said finally, eyes on the ground. I heard the drilling, I replied. Another pause. I still believe water contributed, he added, almost reflexively. I nodded. Maybe it did. Just not the way you thought. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a split second I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Not superiority. Just fatigue. You know, he said quietly. I built that wall myself. Hired a crew, but I designed it. I was proud of it. That explained more than any soil report ever could. When you build something with your own hands, or at least your own vision, it becomes personal. Any flaw feels like a judgment. Any crack feels like a failure. I get that, I said. And I meant it. He nodded once, then walked back down the slope. We never became friends. We're not grilling together on weekends. But we wave again. Small nods. Civil. The temperature cooled from boiling to room level. And here's the part that surprised me most. Somewhere in the middle of all that stress, all those legal bills, all those nights staring at the ceiling, I changed too. At first, shutting off the water was a strategy. A calculated move. Remove the variable, gather evidence, let physics speak. And it worked. But as my lawn browned and cracked, I started to see how easy it is to let pride dry you out the same way. I could have escalated. I could have filed a counterclaim for harassment or demanded reimbursement. I had grounds. Michelle even mentioned it as an option. I didn't. Not because I'm some enlightened saint. I was angry. There were days I fantasized about standing in court while a judge lectured him. Days I replayed his early accusations in my head and came up with sharper responses. But dragging it further would have meant living in that anger longer. Feeding it. Watering it. And I'd already seen what happens when something is overwatered with the wrong intention. The HOA, by the way, stayed mostly out of it. There were whispers, sure. One neighbor asked casually if everything was okay with the wall situation. I kept my answer simple. It's being handled. That became my mantra. Because at some point, you realize not every conflict needs an audience. Not every victory needs applause. What fascinates me, looking back, is how certain Leonard was at the beginning. The confidence. The conviction that he had identified the problem and the culprit. I don't think he set out to be malicious. I think he genuinely believed he was protecting his investment. But belief without full understanding can be dangerous, especially when you wrap it in legal paperwork. There's a lesson in soil behavior that I didn't expect to carry into my own life. Expansive clay needs consistent, moderate moisture to remain stable. Too much fluctuation, especially rapid drying after regular watering, causes shrinkage and movement. Stress builds in the gaps. People aren't that different. We expand and contract with pressure. We react to sudden changes. We misinterpret shifts as attacks. If I had panicked and started overwatering to prove him wrong, maybe the soil would have behaved differently. If I had refused to change anything out of stubbornness, maybe the case would have dragged on longer. Instead, I stepped back. I let the ground tell the story. And it did. Now when I stand in my yard in the early mornings, listening to the soft rhythm of sprinklers ticking back and forth, I don't take it for granted. Water isn't the enemy. Neither is dryness. The problem is imbalance. Leonard reinforced his wall. I adjusted my schedule slightly to ensure deep, infrequent watering that encourages stronger root systems. We both made changes. But here's the question that still lingers, and this is where I'd really like to hear what you think. Was I right to shut everything off and let his wall reveal its weaknesses? Or was that a quiet form of retaliation, even if it was legally smart? And was he wrong to question the impact of my watering in the first place? Or was he just a homeowner trying to protect what he built? Because the truth is, in neighborhoods like ours all across America, these little disputes are constantly simmering under the surface. Lawns, fences, trees, noise, property lines drawn not just in dirt, but in ego. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if, that first afternoon, instead of laughing, I had invited him into the backyard with a beer and asked him to show me exactly what worried him. Would we have avoided months of stress? Or was this collision inevitable because two men were both too sure of their own footing? Conflict doesn't always start with hatred. Sometimes it starts with fear. Fear of loss. Fear of being wrong. Fear that something you built isn't as solid as you thought. Leonard thought water was his enemy. I thought he was mine. Turns out, the real problem was a wall that looked strong but wasn't built for the soil it stood on. So I'm curious, if you were in my position, would you have handled it differently? Would you have fought harder, demanded reimbursement, pushed for an apology? Or would you have done exactly what I did, shut off the water, and let time and physics make the argument? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them. I genuinely want to know where you land on this. And if you've ever had a neighbor dispute that spiraled further than it should have, share that too. Sometimes the best lessons come from the cracks we didn't see forming. If this story made you think a little differently about conflict, pride, or just the quiet power of stepping back, hit that like button and consider subscribing. There are more stories like this, real situations that seem small on the surface but end up revealing something bigger underneath. Because sometimes the ground beneath our feet is telling a story long before we're ready to listen.